Okay, so it is right about 10, so I'll just give this brief introduction. My name is Patrick Keenan, and I'm a PhD student here at the Center for Ethics, a study in human value at the University of Pardubice in Czech Republic. Today is day 2 of our conference, Looking Forward in Hope and Despair, Critical Perspectives on Philosophy, Critical Perspectives on Utopia and Dystopia in Philosophy and the Arts. We have 4 speakers today in the morning session, and up first is Erik Lindman Mata from the School of Culture and Education at Södertörn University in Sweden, and his presentation will be titled On Literature as Oscillation and Oscillation as Utopian. So I would like to welcome Erik Lindman Mata. The floor is yours.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you. So yes, exactly. This, I should say, maybe some sort of caveat before I start. It is an ongoing thing, an ongoing work. So it tilted a bit towards Adorno. It might not correspond exactly to the abstract, but it's more or less in the vicinity of it. And yeah, I'll start. As I said, I posted the text in the chat if anyone wants to follow my speaking, and I'll start. On literature as oscillation and oscillation as utopian. A crucial aspect of this paper is its openly strategic ambitions. It aims to explicate a thinking on utopia that I take to be useful to the left in its broadest sense, namely the concept of a limited utopia, which, together with an oscillating approach, could be a conceptual tool for organizing a way out of capitalism. I argue that the left needs to embrace a non-utopia, but one that won't allow itself to be mixed up with the non-revolutionary social democratic project. Instead of aiming at Eden, we have to sensitize ourselves for where our canyons and pathways actually can lead. The aim, however, is not to bluntly oppose the current use of utopia, but to seek to complement it, double the effort, as it were. The text consists of 4 parts, with slightly different angles. First, utopia as place and the concept of sculptural time. 2, limitation, progress, and the possible. 3, oscillation and literature. And 4, strategy and historical situation. The first part lays down a conceptually necessary foundation for the following 2, where I present my 2 main thoughts, limitation and oscillation, and in the last part, I expound the text's strategic situation. And this emphasis on time also might not really shine through in the abstract. So that's sort of a prerequisite that I've found was needed for the concept of oscillation. 1, utopia as place and the concept of sculptural time. So I want to propose a reversal to an earlier understanding of utopia. When Thomas More writes his Utopia in 1515, or when Samuel Butler, a couple of 100 years later, describes his Erewhon, the utopian idea is decidedly spatial. These were colonial fantasies about faraway countries, contrasting very clearly with the current uses of utopia, which, in a narrow sense of the word, are temporal. Today, we talk about utopia as buried in future landscapes, cut off from our current daily toil. In a conversation on utopia, as a side note, Ernst Bloch and Adorno notes this development from the spatial to the temporal, and in his text, An American Utopia, Frederick Jameson seems also to confirm this shift, if only in passing. But why a reversal? Surely not to reinstate a colonial fantasy, so what is the point? Well, I think it has to do with counterfactuals. The general usage of utopian to describe something impractical and impossible, and as a consequence describe the status quo as inevitable, or as theses turned phise, word lost there, has been rightly criticized by both Adorno and Jameson, to mention just 2. This is in no way an unimportant criticism, but it is not unproblematic. One reason for Adorno's and Jameson's insistence, as I take it, on the need for utopian thought is the perceived decline of a sense of history. And since they equate history with an understanding of the present as changeable, decline is bad news. However, in setting this diagnosis, they betray their allegiance to a narrow and modern sense of history and progress. And I think that this modern concept of history needs to at least be complemented by another understanding of time and of development. To understand utopia as further down the pathway that we are or could be walking is philosophically dubious, but also, I believe, strategically fruitless. Thus, we aim for a reversal in order not to cement a narrow understanding of history and time under the guise of utopia and possibility. This would, of course, also decouple the recent binding together of dystopia and utopia, since the emphasis is no longer on the evaluation of the character of the place, not is it good or bad, but on the distinction of the factual and the counterfactual, the current in the face of the non-current. So what type of space or spatiality would I like us to reverse to? There is no sense, I think, in upholding a categorical philosophical distinction between the phenomena space and time. For sure, there have been substantial attempts at presenting a concept of time that does not limit itself to the linear chronometric time of modern history and modern natural or special sciences. These attempts, however, tend to hypostasize the non-moving or eternal aspects of time, or indeed abstract the phenomenon of time from experience. They tend to take a naive approach to space to contrast space and time. I suggest these two things collapse, or that they for us have always already collapsed. I propose an understanding of time as a sculptural phenomenon. This seems to me a useful way of creating the opportunity to envision something that does not adhere to linear, measured, and I'd say capitalist, logocentric thought. I take this idea of a sculptural time from Marcel Proust, or more specifically, the first pages of Samuel Beckett's essay on Proust. Proust's creatures, Beckett writes, are victims of this predominating condition and circumstance, time. There is no escape from the hours and the days, neither from tomorrow nor from yesterday. There is no escape from yesterday because yesterday has deformed us or been deformed by us. The mood is of no importance. Deformation has taken place. This last sentence is crucial. On the one hand, it stresses the inevitability of time, its tactile and effectual nature. On the other hand, its sculptural character. Time, as it were, takes place, or more aptly, things and phenomena take place, and this taking of place, these depressions or cavities made in the mold of beings, this simply is time. But what bearing does this conception of time as a sculptural phenomenon have on utopia? Firstly, sculptural time opens up the discussion on utopia towards memory studies and alternative ways of understanding the relationship between memory and history. One could think of Walter Benjamin's hidden index as a sort of precursor. Instead of placing history and memory as opposite concepts, one can perhaps discover fruitful conceptual mixes between them, or even radically new ways of understanding historical change and situatedness. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly for this text, it wrests utopia from its connection to the perfect and the Edenic homecoming, very much a linear thing, which leads me to the second part of this text, to limitation, progress, and the possible. I ground a lot of what I want to address in this section on the work of Anna Hidner-Sessien and the conceptual history of progress undertaken by Reinhard Koselleck. I have 4 main points: limited utopia, the possible versus possibility, growth, and diverging utopias. First, I propose, in line with Hidner-Sessien, that the idea of utopia as linked to perfection, something explicitly stated by Adorno and Bloch in the mentioned talk, but implicit in most utopias, with Jameson being an exception, is unviable. I think the connection between utopia and perfection is unviable. Why so? One way to understand this is through the question of whether or not there is any hunger in utopia. Hidner-Sessien answers no. Hunger in utopia, she concludes, must be instantly gratified so that it no longer registers as hunger, but merely as a kind of pleasant, temporary dream state from which one always assuredly wakes. A cornucopia that runs out is reasonably not a very good cornucopia. On the one hand, Hidner-Sessien objects to the perfection of utopia on blunt, practical grounds. Our planetary boundaries seem not to allow for a satiety of unlimited human life. On the other hand, there is a philosophically broader argument about time, namely the fact that loss, lack, bereavement, self-denial, and even failure seem to be constitutively bound up with the phenomenon of time. If time is the taking of place, wholes ought to be the traces of time, and we are, as it were, bounded by it. Here, as a side note, of course, Adorno would accuse me of hypostasizing the false, and there is some merit to his wish that we keep a radical possibility. He contends also in this talk with Bloch that death and the overcoming of death is crucial to utopian thought. But this seems to me a clearly transhistoric position, and at least worthy of some negation from the perspective of us living these falsehoods. But Nersessian goes further than to simply state that this will be the case, that sorrow and trauma will inevitably seep into utopia. She also says that she wants to peel away from perfection and from perfection's etymological commitment to ambition fully implemented. That is, she urges us to voluntarily choose limiting ourselves. We might be bound to always be deformed and to always deform what we meet, but there are modes, timbre, flavor. In other words, intensity is a volitional aspect of the inevitable deformation. In sharp contrast to what we could call a utopia of Eden, Nersessian proposes a limited utopia characterized by a low adjustment. She thus advances a view on utopia that is constituted by absolving, by handing over, and by restraint rather than possession or insatiability. This should, however, not be connected to the argument about perfectibility, that is, a turning away from the perfect cannot rely on lack as simply that which can be or should be amended. What I take Nersessian to suggest thus is a utopia that constantly upholds the space between the factual and the contrafactual, or between the current and the better, a space in which we have to live or that has to be lived. A constant almost that is not just a progression, but also a desired absolving and failure, and of course, success. The second point in this second part of the text deals, at least partly, with Adorno's use of utopia as a way of not hypostasizing the status quo. The problem for Adorno is that the current and existing cannot be taken to be unchangeable and eternal. Utopian thought promises that things can and indeed must be better, and that what is now is not all. Here, Adorno relies, in my view, both on Marx and on, not surprisingly, on Hegel. What is not what it is. This pithy formulation of Adorno points both to the shine character of existing society and the developmental concrete reality of things. The bud, as Hegel puts it in the preface to the Phenomenology, does not stand in contradiction to the flower, and I'd argue the seed is no contradiction of the tree. So far, so good. But where I think Adorno errs is in his juxtaposition, not always apparent, of the non-identical and the utopian. To be sure, this is a complex relationship, but it seems to me that the possibility of change that Adorno clings to in using utopia or emphasizing utopian discourse is exactly the type of apostatizing or reification of the universal that he denounces in Hegel's mixing of the particular, Besonderes, and particularity, Besonderheit. The possibility that Adorno, and to a lesser extent the anti-utopianism of Jameson, clings to is exactly not the possible, but possibility. It is a hypostasized counterfactual that instead of looking at the actual teleologies or possibilities, the cavities of the sculpture, of which Adorno does talk, albeit briefly and rather with Plato than with Proust in mind, these possibilities are not the same as the commonsensical practical, but is simply the objective or concrete aspect of the current, the development of these things, of our development. This differentiation between possibility and the possible and the comparison with Hegel leads me to my third point, namely that of growth. As I already pointed out, the anti-progress argument, both Nersessian's and mine, is based loosely on Koselleck's explication of the concept of progress. To be clear, I don't want to bicker about the possible impracticalities of endless growth, but rather refuse a certain type of growth, which, endless or not, sees an actual end, aims for an end further down the road. Why is this problematic? My argument is simple. Certain developments do not allow for skipping steps, and we can't see all intermingling movements. The Hegel of the Phenomenology, of course, talks in terms of ends and teleology, but what is more important for this text is his emphasis on the working through of things. The revolution has happened, it is born, but it is not finished. The seed sprouts, but it is not yet the plant it will be, etc. This also goes for utopia. Now, obviously, the psyche or the spirit or thought, and I'll have to be vague here, is not a plant. Not all developments are as step-bound or gradual as that of a growing material organism. But there is, I think, some merit to arguing that the human psyche, however free its phantasmatic or imaginary powers are, does show a sluggishness that can be equated with a material boundedness. One thinks of Sigmund Freud's concept of Durcharbeiten, which underlies the fact that the analysis is in no means finished when the analyst has succeeded in pointing out the resistances or the problems that the analysand has refused to acknowledge. Showing resistance is not the same as breaking it down or letting it go. Resistance is, of course, a concept that is closely connected to Adorno, but it seems he does not acknowledge this type of resistance, this tardiness, at least not in his discussions on Utopia. What I'm aiming at here, my fourth point, is the overarching risk that there will be mutually incongruent utopian developments or goals. What is not what it is. Yes, this is true, but what is not one, but multiple, albeit limited possible developments. Everything is possible, but not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily now, not simultaneously. This is not a consequence of positing a positive conception of utopia, but rather inherent in the very fact of non-identity, of particular and different developments, different indentations in the sculpture, and importantly, the possibility that one can always depart from utopia. That is the problem of falsity and consequently of wounds. The memory of a wound is not simply solved by entering into a non-wounded state. The being raised in the false is, as Adorno does acknowledge, perhaps not fit for the true. Thus, the development will not allow us skipping ahead. 3, oscillation and literature. This leads me to my third part, which concerns the ever so actual question, what to do then? I propose that oscillation could function as a practical political trope to understand how to judge one's own moment in a utopian development and indeed how to live such a realization. Oscillation, one could say, as akin to the therapeutic situation. Here I have 3 points. First off, I will briefly explicate the concept of idiorhythmy as used by Roland Barthes. Then I will describe in what way this is connected with literature. And lastly, I quarrel again a bit with Adorno and his promesse de bonheur. It is in his seminar titled How to Live Together that Barthes develops a utopian discourse that hinges on the concept of idiorhythmy, a term he borrows from Jacques Lacarrière, but which he infuses with his own theoretical content. He takes as his exemplary starting point the communities of early monks and anachorites who would offer both communal and personal spaces, creating an oscillation between the rules, schedules, and strictures of the monastery and the idiosyncratic or personal desires of the individuals. What I take the core of Barthes' project to be is the supple and rhythmical, in contradistinction to metrical, cohabitation of the individual and the collective, but also extrapolated between different life forms or developments. The prefix of the term is crucial, since that is what for Barthes stops the rhythm turning rigid and regulative. The simplest way of understanding this is to see this idios as a way of stopping rhythm turning into meter. Idiorhythmy is relational, not durational, variable, not fixed, and it points to and allows what evades or cannot be made to fit the meter. This reflects what I perceive to be a larger oscillating movement visible in some of Barthes' works, perhaps aptly formulated in his pondering in mythologies on the relationship between France and wine, where he states that wine is objectively good and at the same time the goodness of wine is a myth, a colonial myth, and this causes us to constantly drift between the object and its demystification. I argue, partially building on Narcessian's idea of the genre secular realism, that literature might be construed as an objective expression of this idiorhythmy and oscillation. Secular realism, according to Narcessian, briefly summarized, is a phenomenological sensitivity, a way of describing the existing in a way that shows its immanent connection to the non-existing, or by quoting Narcessian, quoting Barthes, realism is genuinely weird. Without making all too sweeping claims, I would say that this applies to texts in general, if not all, then at least quite a few, and not only to those emphasized by Narcessian. For example, I take the Swedish literary critic Michaela Blomqvist's essay Literature and Reality in Postmodernity on Peter Handke to depict this generality. She writes that what Handke's later writings show is that this minimal surface between a train track and a runway and a motorway can be expanded into what appears to be eternity. How much does a human contain? The world is tirelessly nuanced, and contemporary with me is all I can picture. To be clear, these are just two literary examples. The same structure could be seen in Celan or another sense in the documentary prose of Lispector or Mayaker, just to mention a few. Fundamentally, it is about stitching together the temporally possible with the spatially existing, a rather blunt turn of phrase perhaps, which, to once again quote Narcessian, allows futurity itself to remain anchored by the pressures of a materially restrictive present. The space created by the overlay of language on the real, the slit between signifier and what is signified, this gap which we know so much about, this is the space where we live, but also where there is any chance of at all of change. Oscillating between language and the phenomena, one comes to see both the possible and the existing. This turns utopia on its head in a sense. Future becomes place-bound, the non-place becomes place. Now, the idea of art somehow showing what could be possible through a performative non-coherence, of course, comes very close to Adorno's Promesse de Bonheur, in which the artwork encapsulates the antagonizing incoherence of society. As the historian S.D. Krostowska puts it, when summarizing Adorno's Promesse, art keeps the promise of happiness not by making good on it, but by withholding immediate happiness. By denying immediate wish fulfillment, redeeming happiness in a roundabout dialectical fashion, pleasure wanting eternity, as Adorno notes, following Nietzsche. But what differentiates my proposed oscillation from this is that it isn't a promise. It does not aim for perfection. It insists on pleasure not necessarily wanting eternity, but rather that there is at least some sort of pleasure that can grow in this small, disappointing and joyous, obvious, but unstable hither and thither, that human life currently is. And the last section, 4, strategy and historical situation. As it happens, it looks like I've run out of time and that I will not be able to really explicate my 4th theme, that of strategy, a failure on my part, perhaps. But luckily, I mentioned it in the beginning and it was already there, and perhaps its meaning or importance wasn't entirely visible until we turned the sculpture around anyway. I want to end, though, with repeating that I do not wish to supplant utopian thought, but merely complement it. There is some merit to utopia, but simply revealing truth does not do away with the false, and at the very least, there needs to be a serious working through of what is revealed, a lot of kneading, molding, and growing. From this perspective, the non-utopian view I've outlined above seems like a fruitful addition. One could perhaps call all of this a sort of dual power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have about 9 minutes for questions. And if you have a question, just type your name into the chat box. So it looks like we have one name already, Lyra. Lyra, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you, Erik. I really enjoyed your paper. I was just wondering, what sort of role would embodiment play in your notion of utopia? Because especially departing from Proust and his metaphors of deformity, those are extremely body-bound rather than place-bound. So is actually sort of the place, the utopian place that you're talking about, the human body with its sculpturality, its limitations, its deformations, etc.
Thank you. Yes, I would say I would say so, but also maybe not differentiate between them without making it too much of a muddle. But I mean, the human body will also interact with its place, etc., etc. But definitely, it is the idea of the sculpture also connects to the idea of a body and not necessarily a landscape. I mean, the sculpture is up to today in many ways a body or the body of a certain being. So yes, I would say so, and it's good. It's a good connection, but it's interesting that with the body because of course the body has a very different function in Adorno, where it is the sort of somatic, where it is the impressions of things, but it is not. I mean, he talks a lot about fleeing the pain, and when he talks about utopia, he says that the body sort of feels that it wants to flee away from the bad thing. That's why we want to go towards utopia. But I think that's not very, that doesn't really square well with this idea of the sculpture, because of course you will keep your indentations also when fleeing from what made that impression. But yeah, I would say yes as the shortest possible answer.
And of course, the body sculpted by time in Proust is rather monstrous.
Yeah.
And not particularly beautiful.
No, exactly, and this is the point. I mean, that's why this is how I take Adorno when he says that which I mentioned briefly when he says that there might not be a place for the individuals who grow up in the false to sort of enjoy the true. This is of course out of monstrosity, that if we take the truth to not be this type of monstrosity, then monsters would feel awkward there.
Well, thank you.
I think Hugo actually has a question.
Yeah, no, I was just because no one else was asking something. Two things. I recently read Bloch's inaugural lecture when he came to Tübingen, and it's quite interesting what he says there. I think that it's not at all the sort of the linear progression. It's something much more complicated than that. So that might be something that could be of interest. But then a more question. Sometimes I got the feeling that your view of utopia was non-political in a certain sense. Because if we picture utopia as basically a political phenomenon, then just because certain kinds of exploitation is not there anymore in this utopia, that doesn't necessarily mean that people will be less unhappy. There will be different forms of unhappiness than we are suffering from now. So it's only if we sort of present a utopia as a solution to every possible problem in human existence, then the problem you are pointing to would be there. But if we only see it as a political thing, then it isn't a promesse de bonheur, it's something else.
Yeah, this is crucial, of course, and I'm sort of bashing at Jameson a bit, but to be completely honest, he is a bit more nuanced in the later sections of An American Utopia, and he does talk about the fact that there is some sort of sorrow or strife in his proposed utopia. What I think like the connection to Eden and the connection to perfection. First of all, I think this is how a lot of people use utopia. I think this is how utopia is used in the common discourse, and therefore I sort of attack or try to nuance that usage. But also, if you look at the origin of utopia at More's or similar literary examples of utopia, they are of course political. They describe states, but they are also meant to be some sort of Eden. They're meant to be they, at least to me, they ooze of this idea of salvation, which is of course perfect in a broader sense than the political. So I think there is some sort of tension there. But of course, if you view it as a political thing, it becomes less obvious. Yeah, for sure. The perfection becomes less.
Okay, up next is Philip.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you, firstly, for thereby suggesting to me or making interesting to me Roland Barthes, the How to Live Together, and the concept of what is it, ideorhythmy. That's very interesting and might be promising for me in what I do. And then my question would be, in a way, and that relates, I guess, to the ideorhythmy in a way, is that how the feeling I got from what you presented was that there's a concern with the relation between the individual and the collective, and the collective, and utopia is often taken to be concerned with the collective, maybe in some place or in some future or something. And then the question is so, and with the concept of ideorhythmy, you point to how, you know, maybe this kind of the non-identical can find a place in that, or how the collective can be composed of individuals in a kind of, how do you put it, supple and rhythmical cohabitation of the individual and the collective. So I'm not sure if I understood all of this perfectly, but maybe you can tell me more about this. But so what I would then be interested in is, in a way, so if you have here the individual and the collective, isn't there also the kind of the sphere of the interpersonal, you know, as something that cannot be reduced to either the individual or the collective? And might that not be also very important in a way? Maybe especially when one thinks about something like a, you know, I want to carefully call it something like a moral dimension to utopia, something like what is some kind of orientation point? And then, you know, in a way, what comes back is some kind of relational notion, me others or me other, and how you know, and then maybe categories like, you know, caring about others or something like this come into play. So just to bring into play the kind of second personal here, if you want, in between the first personal and the collective, the third personal. Yeah, so this is not really a question, but just something, you know, maybe you can elaborate on that or add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's good. I should say also that I use the concept of idiorhythmy here with the backdrop of the possible, or like the actual and the counter factual, or the possible and the actual, as a metaphor, sort of, or not a metaphor, but as a, what I want to say is that the relationship between the individual and the collective is similar to the one of the actual to the non-actual, because the non-actual is also a sort of plurality and this oscillation that is going on and about between the individual and the collective, I think could be useful as a trope between the actual and the non-actualities. But of course, still you could raise the question of the interpersonal, and I think I think it's a good question, or a good sort of addition. I'm not sure what more to say about it, actually, but I will think about it. Yeah, I think it's...
Yeah, maybe, yeah, exactly. It could also be just thought as a, you know, an impulse for you. Maybe you can profit from it in some way. For
sure. And I should just want to add before, because now we're out of time, but on Hugo's question as well, I think there is still, I know Narcissia has a section about this in her book, A Limited Utopia, or Utopia Limited, where she also sort of points to the fact that there is an increase also in the left to want to use utopia or utopian discourse in order to force change. You look at history and you look at sort of demands made by different social movements, and the demand has to be larger than what you sort of get in the end. And this trope has been really broadened, I think, and also in that sense, it becomes sort of an affinity of, or you create an affinity between the perfect and utopia, because you say, if our demands are very high, then at least we'll get something. And this is, I think, not necessarily true, because there are so many different high demands and so many different roads to those different described utopias.
Cool. Thank you so much, Erik. Give a silent round of applause. So I will add Piotr. So up next, we have Piotr Sawczyński from the Institute of Political Science and International Relations at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. And he will be presenting, his presentation is titled, Moving Back as Moving Forward, Jewish Philosophy and the Restorative Messianic Utopia. Piotr, you have a few extra minutes too, so at the end, so don't worry about that, but the screen is yours. Thank you.
Great, and thank you very much. Thanks for this introduction. Just tell me first, please, guys, if you can hear me well. Yeah, all right, because I'm just being away from home today, so I just don't know if the connection in the place where I'm at right now is fine. But if you can hear me, that's great. So good morning once again to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be presenting in front of you. Greetings from snowy Krakow, by the way. And just as Patrick said, I'm going to say something about the connection of utopia and restoration. Actually, it will be a kind of a short case study. It shouldn't take me actually more than 15 minutes to present what I'm going to say. So there will be some time for discussion, I hope, afterwards. But let's get it started. So, in his famous essay titled Progress or Return, published in 1952, Leo Strauss, who is a conservative classic, but also a prominent interpreter of Jewish philosophical tradition, analyzes the two fundamental political and religious concepts, progress and return, in the context of Jewish tradition. And he argues that the modern ideal of progress has backfired, leading us to, as he calls it, the brink of an abyss and bringing about the unprecedented crisis of Western civilization. Consequently, a contemporary man needs to be, quote, redeemed from progress, unquote, and brought back to tradition. This application of the Messianic idiom to the critique of progress might be surprising because Strauss has not infrequently ascribed the sacralization of progress to the heritage of secular messianism, like historical materialism. However, the main thesis of his text is that the association of messianism with the idea of progress is the distortion of its original message. He argues that messianic idea in Judaism, historically the first and metaphysically perhaps the most substantial, has been characterized by the idea of restoration and not progress. In other words, it's about the past and not about the future. Let me quote here: "The life of the Jew is a life of anticipation, of hope, but the hope for redemption is restoration. The thought that the past is superior to the present is then perfectly compatible with the hope for the future. The perfect end is the return to the perfect beginning," unquote. And to support this thesis of the restorative root of Jewish messianism, Strauss refers to Gershom Scholem, perhaps the most prominent 20th century theorist of Jewish mysticism, who devoted a load of his work to the messianism of Isaac Luria and his disciples, perhaps the most important messianic doctrine in the modern Kabbalah, initiated in the Middle East in the 16th century and continued, for example, by the notorious Sabbatai Tzvi. Again, quote from Strauss: "As I learned from Scholem, Kabbalah prior to the 16th century concentrated upon the beginning. It was only with Isaac Luria that it began to concentrate upon the future, upon the end. Yet even here, the last age became as important as the first. It did not become more important. Furthermore," and now Strauss goes on to quote Scholem, "by inclination and habit, Luria was decidedly conservative. For him, salvation means actually nothing but restitution, reintegration of the original whole, or tikkun, to use the Hebrew term. The path to the end of all things is also the path to the beginning," unquote. And now in my paper, I'd like to argue that by limiting himself to this single excerpt from Scholem's opus magnum called Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Strauss actually seriously misreads his account of Luria's messianism and consequently distorts the idea of restoration present in Lurianism, at least in the way it was interpreted by Scholem. What Strauss actually does, I argue, is the attribution of Greek concepts to the analysis of Lurianic messianism, and by extension, interpretation of the whole Jewish idea of return in strictly Neoplatonic terms. So I'm going to show that the messianism Luria spoke of is not really about the return to the actual origins, but rather about restoring the origins that, due to cosmological and historical raptures, had never existed. Thereby, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, Jewish messianism is much more dialectical than Strauss would like to see it. It's neither restorative, like in Jewish Neoplatonism, for example, nor progressive, like in secular messianism, but it's rather restorative and progressive at the same time. Let me start, however, by saying that Strauss is not completely wrong when he suggests that Kabbalah is a restitution of Greek thinking in the heart of Judaism. Indeed, Neoplatonic inspirations characterized quite a number of medieval Kabbalistic doctrines which adopted the language of emanationism to argue that all living creatures once emerged from the divine principle and still participate in its unity. These Greek influences have obviously been exercised by the Rabbinic Judaism, which has always accentuated the absolute separation of God and the world and assumed creatio ex nihilo, as the only genesis of earthly beings, which avoids falling into pantheistic formulations. And now, what makes Luria stand out in Jewish Kabbalah is that he actually accepts creatio ex nihilo, but refuses to faithfully adopt it as a dogma. Instead, he examines the original ambiguity of Judaic creation, namely how to reconcile the existence of perfect divine substance and something as extremely negative as nothing. And this dilemma brings Luria to a paradoxical, but I believe highly logical conclusion that creation out of nothing must have been preceded by creation of the nothing itself. And from this, Luria explains through a two-stage process how God manifests himself in the world. The key concept here is tzimtzum, the Hebrew word which stands for contraction. Rather than simply manifesting himself externally in his full glory, God first withdraws to just one point of himself. And this radical self-reduction aims to generate a kind of a void out of which all beings are going to be created. What is left in the void is only the remnant of contracted divine light, which Luria calls reshimu. And this receding of God within himself, described by Scholem as his, quote, primordial exile or self-banishment, unquote, is for Luria necessary to make possible the existence of independent, non-divine beings. And now, only once God has contracted himself does he second manifest himself by directing his weakened powers toward the void for the sake of creation. However, even this act of emanation involves a fundamental moment of rupture. In Luria's evocative imagery, the contracted God shapes containers, which are then supposed to be forms filled with the light of life. Unfortunately, the vessels are made from reshimu, which makes them so tinged with nothingness or negativity that confronted with the divine glare, they just break up and they start falling into the cosmic abyss together with the scattered sparks of divinity. Shebirat HaKelim, or the breaking of the vessels, is a founding catastrophe, which results in a general deficiency and displacement of things in this world. In Scholem's words, let me quote once again, nothing remains in its proper place, everything is somewhere else, in exile, in need of being redeemed, unquote. So, in a world so fatally scarred with catastrophe, the final and crucial episode of the cosmological process must be tikkun, which in Hebrew stands for a perfection, a betterment, or a correction of things. Interestingly, the idea of tikkun is not originally Lurianic, but in medieval Kabbalah, it had a different meaning. There, and basically following Plato, it was believed that contemplative devotion is generally enough to permit every human soul to return to its original state of perfection. And in contrast, Luria, building on his insistence of the cosmic rupture, claims that this primordial perfection never existed, and so it cannot be reconstructed. That's why, in Scholem's view, Lurianic tikkun originates a new type of the Messianic idea where, let me quote, the renewal of the world is simply more than its restoration, unquote. In Luria, this renewal requires the liberation of divine sparks from their entrapment in the material sphere, because only then might God be powerful enough to redeem this world and recreate it in such a way that, well, everything is finally in its right place. So let us notice that contrary to what was argued by Strauss, the return in Lurianic terms, at least the way Scholem interprets it, doesn't mean reintegration of something as it once was. It's rather the return to that which could have been but never was. In other words, the Lurianic Messianism is not about the restitution of the past, but about its recreation or about the actualization of the original potentiality. Let me quote a fragment from Scholem's major essay titled Toward an Understanding of the Messianic Idea in Judaism. The world of Tikkun, the re-establishment of the harmonious condition of the world, which in the Lurianic Kabbalah is the Messianic world, still contains a strictly utopian impulse. This harmony, which it reconstitutes, that does not at all correspond to any condition of things that has ever existed, even in paradise, but at most to a plan contained in the divine idea of creation. This plan, however, even with the first stages of its realization, came up against the disturbance and hindrance of the cosmic process known as the breaking of the vessels, which initiates the Lurianic myth. In reality, therefore, the last days realized a higher, richer, and more fulfilled condition of the first days, and even the Kabbalists remain bound to a utopian conception, unquote. So we can say at the end that in Scholem's famous typology, the Lurianic Kabbalah clearly does not represent the restorative messianism, but as he calls it, the utopian catastrophic one. The idea of a return to a non-historical origin, like in the Neoplatonic doctrine of emanationism, which Scholem, by the way, calls a misfortune of the Kabbalah, is for him just an intellectual phantasm. Unlike conservative restitution, the Lurianic redemption does not seek to restore a previous stage, but to decompose and displace it. At the same time, however, Scholem widely uses in his analysis the Neoplatonic idiom of return as a major point of reference, as if to show that even the most prospective thinking cannot help but think about the past. That is why I believe that the Jewish corrective of Neoplatonic restorationism that we find in the modern Kabbalah not only challenges the apparent opposition of progress and return, but also shows that the idioms of Greek and Jewish thought might actually productively intermingle and come up with an idea that could never be originated in pure Neoplatonism or just pure Jewish theology. Thank you very much. That's it for now. And of course, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Piotr. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, just type your name in the chat box, and then I will call on you. But I think maybe I'll just start off with some quick kind of thoughts and get your thoughts on this. Yeah, I'm curious about the kind of the restorative concept and how it works kind of in the present day. And I don't have a lot of experience with religious philosophy, but this is why I think you'll be able to kind of clear up some questions I have. But I'm curious actually, sometimes when I'm talking with people who do have kind of strong religious beliefs, there's sort of a limit to what they are able to imagine is possible on Earth. So the fact that they have this set of beliefs that kind of transcend the Earth, it limits their ability to think of what's conceptually possible, and they actually think that they kind of resist certain ideas, thinking that they're not possible because, for example, if you believe that God designed man and that man is by nature flawed creatures, then there can be no such thing as a utopia on Earth. Any attempt to move towards it will always kind of lead to failure. And so it's those religious beliefs which actually, I think, undermine sometimes kind of the progress that I see that could possibly happen because there's a lack of belief kind of just rooted in their fundamental beliefs. So I'm curious, maybe based on what you've just said, if there's anything different kind of in your research that you've discovered that might, in terms of the Jewish faith, that could complement that idea. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for this. Well, obviously, I believe it's very easy to fall into this distinction of, being beyond and being future-oriented and thinking in purely eschatological terms, and thinking about right here and right now, and just secularizing all this messianic concept and building again some kind of political utopias. But what I believe is pretty interesting in this Lurianic inspirations, which right now, for example, are very much elaborated by George Agamben or Jacques Derrida. This is actually pretty influential strand of thought in today's continental philosophy, is that this Lurianic inspirations, actually, they are not only about future, they are not really about present, and definitely they are not, as I have shown, about coming back to the past. Of course, if we are not very friendly to this way of thinking, we can say that, well, this is like retrotopia that Bauman was writing about shortly before his death. But I believe that what it enables us to do is to somehow deactivate very strict oppositions or try to deactivate very strict identities. For example, Agamben in his philosophies uses the Lurianic Kabbalah to think about what he calls whatever subject or whatever being. So a kind of a being which transcends the opposition of individual and collective. And I believe, using these categories, of course, I could elaborate, I should elaborate on it, and we don't have enough time, but I believe it enables us to say about, let me say, whatever time. So the time which is not purely future-oriented, which is not really about right here and right now, and is not definitely about the past, but the time that somehow tries to break all these temporal divisions. So I believe this is actually pretty inspiring, although very risky. There are a lot of guys like Roberto Esposito, for example, who question, who actually undermine this idea of messianism by claiming that, well, theology, especially political theology, is always about making distinctions between, you know, the human and the divine, the worldly and the heavenly, etc., etc. So playing with the idiom of messianism to deconstruct the opposition, while messianism is itself a part of theology which reinforces this distinction, well, it's a crazy thing to do. But there are some guys who do it, like Agamben, for example, or Derrida, who I just mentioned. Okay, so far so good. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. Up next, Vladimir.
Thank you for that presentation. It was really inspiring and it was really cool. And I was kind of thinking about it, about the two readings that you have mentioned. And while thinking about the concept of utopia, and based on those two readings, I fear that they both suffer from one flaw when we are talking about the utopian view. Namely, there is one really interesting thought from Bernard Williams when he criticizes ethical nostalgia. And when talking about utopia based on reconstruction of the past, and talking about utopia based on bringing back the past times, I fear that both of them are based on this ethical nostalgia. Having said that, if you're reconstructing the past and if you're trying to implement those principles in the current society or in the future society or in the present society, or it is actually really confusing when you think about the concept of time in this regard, as you have mentioned earlier. But still talking about it, it seems to have one flawed premise, which is we know that these principles will work, and we know that these principles are implementable, to say the least, because we, at the end of the day, don't really know that, because those principles are not closely related to the contemporary context as they were in the past context. On the other hand, it also, I mean, one really elegant way to get away from this problem is to fragmentize the concept of time. But if you do not fragmentize the concept of time, then you are making one, if you're holding that view, you're making one mistake in which you are cutting away that historical progression, which is rather interesting to note. But yeah, I mean, those two flaws in the way of thinking about utopia based on reconstruction or bringing back the past principles are criticizable from the standpoint of Bernard Williams.
Yeah, thank you very much for this remark. Very valuable one, of course. I believe that it is very risky actually to take, you know, these single concepts from the 16th century Kabbalah and try to implement them right here, right now. It's a totally different context. A lot of guys try to do it within deconstruction, for example, because this Kabbalistic thinking actually very much corresponds to the linguistic turn of the 20th century humanities, right? There is this emphasis on the world actually created through language, etc., etc. But Lurianic Kabbalah can be read in a totally different way. Yeah, so I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I believe I can agree with you. Let me just point maybe to one interesting thing that Scholem, who I was talking about, once mentioned that actually if there is no catastrophic event at the very beginning, there is no foundation for any Messianic thought or any utopian thinking. And even this Lurianic, like purely catastrophical cosmology, can be interpreted in a totally different way. For example, I read a couple of comments reinterpreting Lurianic Kabbalah right here and right now, to try to see in this, well, apparently catastrophic event, the Jewish equivalent of, well, nominalist revolution, like, you know, proto-liberal kind of thinking, where actually this separation was no drama, it was no catastrophe, it was something that should have happened and did happen for the liberation of individuals. So is there any foundation for messianism in this case? Not really, but all these guys I mentioned, like Derrida, Agamben, etc., even Rosy Braidotti from the post-humanist perspective, try to say, yes, there was some initial catastrophe, and we need to try our best to, you know, put things right. For example, using these old-fashioned terminology or old-fashioned concepts. Risky, I agree, but.
Thank you very much for the answer. It's quite inspiring. Thank you.
Okay, next, Erik has a question.
Thank you, Piotr. I just wonder about this, or to put it simply, if I wonder if there's anything in Scholem or in your work here that sort of pinpoints the need of something to happen before restoration, however you understand restoration, as some sort of messianic entrance or not, or sort of like an happening or an event. If you want to say something about that, or if that's not needed in this view. And then I'd also, because my thoughts when you were sort of nuancing restoration was, first of all, Benjamin and his different historical philosophical writings, but also Paul Celan, which in his Büchner Preisrede has a very he talks a lot about the revolution as the old way of talking about revolution as the circular movement, the coming home. But in this traveling, in this trip, there is a step. So this would be akin to the messianic entrance. There's something that happens, and therefore restoration is not a going back to something that was before, but it has changed. Mm-hmm. So it's just wondering if this is also a necessary component, the event or the messianic entrance of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Very good question, thank you. The answer is yes, it is a necessary component. And another important thing is that it's absolutely not enough to, you know, devote yourself to some prayings or try to live in a pious way. No, it's a purely activist doctrine. And I believe that's why it inspired a lot of politically oriented guys. Even Sabbatai Tzvi, whom I already mentioned, had this very crazy idea of redemption through sin, right? And this is purely taken from Lurianic cosmology, because if there are these sparks of divinity trapped in the material sphere, well, we need to get down to the, you know, depths of materiality and try to somehow redeem these sparks. Well, how to do it? For example, Jacob Frank was about, you know, committing crimes or doing sins, because that's only by entering the domain of evil you can redeem what's trapped there. So actually there are very antinomian and very heretic implications of this activist idea. There are some others who claim that actually we should rather work on language and not do any political actions, because first of all, language is political, and second of all, well, the very metaphysics of Lurianic Kabbalah was purely linguistic. So perhaps when Luria was speaking about doing something, maybe he was rather thinking about using language in a certain way. So many different implications, but definitely it's an activist doctrine, and definitely it's not enough to, you know, live in a pious way. And this is a clear break with previous Kabbalistic thinking. Okay, maybe enough right now. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Erik, and thank you, Piotr. So Piotr had a 3-minute late start, so let's add a few more minutes for you to be fair. And I think Philip actually has a question.
Let me just say, because somebody asked if it's possible for me to share my paper with you. Obviously, I will just convert it into the PDF, and in 5 minutes you should have it in the chat window. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, if anybody else has a question, please go ahead, because I feel like I'm asking a lot and I don't want to take anybody else's time away. But then I also don't want to wait too long, because then the time will go away anyway. So I will just go and ask. Okay. Yeah, basically I liked very much in the way you kind of complicated this often simplistically understood opposition between the return, this kind of restorative move towards what was in the past, and the progressive move, towards the new whatever world, society, and so the way you framed it at one point is that, I don't know, echoing exactly whom here, so you juxtapose the return to what was versus the return to what was not, but what could have been. And then what came to my mind is that maybe, yeah, I basically would like to hear whether you think this is along the same lines of thought, that very often I feel like this return in itself has a progressive moment, especially when this return is not understood in terms of just a state of affairs, something objectively there, but something like how we could be or should be or may be, and just two thinkers that I have in mind here would be, on the one hand, someone like Nietzsche. There's definitely someone very going back very far, but at the same time very radically, in a sense, progressive in the sense of discarding all there is. And on the other hand, someone like Buber, Martin Buber, who also, he draws a lot, of course, from very ancient Judaic ideas and thoughts, but it is very much future oriented. So I just, this kind of bringing together in a very interesting way, this kind of backwards and forwards trend. So do you think this goes along with what you had in mind?
Well, absolutely. You mentioned Nietzsche, and Erik, I believe, also mentioned Walter Benjamin, who was directly inspired, maybe not directly, but was inspired by Luria Fruchol and his lifelong friend. And actually this idea of origin as emergence, right? Not really the descent, not really the static beginning, but the emergence, the constant intermingling of the past and the present, etc. It's very present in most of these thinkers. Nietzsche, definitely, although his inspirations were a little bit different. Walter Benjamin, definitely. And guys like today, for example, Derrida and some other deconstructionists. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I actually believe that this idea of dynamic origin is one of the most inspiring and productive ideas hidden in this Lurianic heritage. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Piotr. And I would like to welcome, I have to find Šárka. Okay, I'll spotlight Šárka. So up next we have Šárka Lojdová from the Department of Aesthetics at Charles University in the Czech Republic. And she will be presenting Are We Looking Forward, Utopia and Dystopia as a Mirror of the Present Society? And so Šárka, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. So I try to share my screen. So I hope you can see it now.
Yes.
So the conference title is Looking Forward in Hope and Despair, implies that utopia and dystopia provide us with a vision of the future. But are we really looking forward? In my presentation, I will argue, following thought of an American philosopher Arthur C. Danto, that utopias and dystopias say about our current state of affairs. Therefore, they reflect our present hopes and despairs. Although Danto is known mainly as a philosophy of art, He paid systematic attention to the philosophy of history at the beginning of his career, especially to the question of historical explanation. In his writing on history, he introduced the term narrative, defined as a story used to explain past events. Since the conference topic addresses utopias and dystopias as a vision of world's future, it might be surprising that I am to tackle with the philosophy of history. Danto's account of history was, however, generous enough. History does not limit itself to past events, but it has to cover present and future. This thesis goes hand in hand with Danto's understanding of the term narrative. The argument of analytical philosophy of history in a nutshell is that historians use narratives for an explanation or revealing the meaning of particular past events, or better, that it is the task of historian to provide us with the meaning of a specific occurrence, and that the narrative serves best for this purpose. As I have already mentioned, Danto also insisted that the future is an integral part of history. According to him, historical meaning of an event is permanently altered regarding future events. Each event's meaning is retrospectively revisited, since we can connect it with future events, future in a sense of that are future from the point of view of the past event. Consequently, a historian finds herself in a better position than a witness of the event because the witness cannot predict the fallout of the particular occurrence. Without knowing the impact of the event, one cannot grasp its meaning. The retrospective character of knowledge is, as I will to demonstrate, crucially important for my point. I will show that artistic representation of the future, utopias and dystopias included, read and interpreted from retrospect, reveal much more about their present moment, so about the moment where they were written, than about the future itself. In the opening passage of his essay The End of Art, Danto meditates on the art of the future. By this he means that the art that will be in time that will come. According to Danto, one cannot predict how the future artworks, quote, will look like or how they will be appreciated, end quote. To prove this point, he addresses the visionary artist Albert Robida, who published the serial publication Le XXe siècle in 1882, aiming to show the world as it would be in 1952. Danto sums up, quote, his pictures are filled with wonders to come, the telephonoscope, flying machines, television, and the water metropolises, but the pictures themselves are unmistakable of their own era, as it is way much of what they show is shown. Robida would imagine that there would be restaurants in the sky to which customers would come in airborne vehicles, but the boldly anticipated eating places are put together of ornamental ironworks of the sort associated with La Salle and Gare Saint-Lazare, and look a lot like steamboats that floated the Mississippi at the time in proportion and in decoration fretwork. They are patronized by gentlemen in top hats and ladies in bustles, served by waiters wearing cloth aprons from Belle Epoque, and they arrive in balloons Montgolfier would recognize. We may be certain that where Robida had to depict it an underwater art museum, its most advanced works would be impressionist paintings if Robida had eyes even for those. End quote. Of course, as Danto emphasized, if we compare this vision with the real state of 1952, we will be struck how archaic and old-fashioned Robida's ideas was. But this is not the whole story. In the Transfiguration of the Commonplace, Danto addresses how artistic representations absorb conventions and atmosphere of the time they were produced, but from a slightly different perspective. He touches upon the topic of the context of specification of the term style. I cannot go into particulars of this term, but it refers to a specific feature of artistic representation. For Danto, artworks bear traces of their artist's writing and historical period in that the piece was made. This feature Danto illustrates on the example of engraving depicting Charles Dickens' portrait accompanying many of his books. Although the portrait represents a particular historical personality, it reveals more about the historical period than about the shape of Dickens' face. According to Danto, the portrait was drawn with respect to Victoria's era artistic conventions. At the same time, in Victorian England, people were unable to tell that the portrait is typical of their age. What used to be invisible for the contemporaries is evident for us looking at the piece from retrospect. If an artist made a picture today, she would probably use portrait photography, but still, the photography itself would be a witness of conventions of our time. Putting together with Danto's reading of Robida publication, one can conclude a rule that we can detect the traces of conventions of a particular period in artworks, and that this rule has a general validity. So I believe that this principle works for any media of art, but I'm also convinced that we can recognize not only artistic but also social and historical conventions. I aim to demonstrate that the traces of particular historical period enter into an artwork automatically. I mean that it is not a necessarily intentional activity of an artist. Danto did not explicitly consider utopias and dystopias. However, given the general validity of the thesis, I think I will refer to Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. My choice of the specific Atwood's book is not accidental, but grounded on contextual and historical circumstances accompanying the book's publication and its transformation in a Hulu series. Moreover, Hulu's adaptation provides us with a valuable tool. The future imagined by Atwood has become our present and past, and accordingly, we can compare her ideas and visions with reality. So we had a wonderful presentation of the Handmaid's Tale yesterday, so I will be brief here. So Handmaid's Tale was published in 1855, in 1985, sorry. And it is a dystopian novel that's set in the near future. In the totalitarian theocratic state of Gilead, a radical religious group called Son of Jacob overthrew the democratic regime of the United States and suspended the American Constitution. Accordingly, human rights guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence were lost, especially for women. Women were not allowed to read, write, or handle money anymore. And most importantly, they were deprived of control over their reproduction. Women cannot decide whether they want a child or not. Still, fertile ones were assigned to an infantile martial couple from the upper class, to a commander and his wife, to serve them as an handmaid, to deliver them a baby that the couple cannot have by themselves. As Atwood described, the future society is characterized by a low population. Fewer and fewer healthy children were born, and handmaids have become a solution for this situation. Atwood talks about real-life events that inspired her story in the interview for the Penguin publisher's blog. She went through her archive and newspaper clippings from the time she wrote Handmaid's Tale. In explaining the central motive of the book, Atwood claims, quote, women forced to have babies. This is an article about Ceausescu in Romania. He passed laws that said women had to have 4 babies. They had to have pregnancy tests every month, and if they weren't pregnant, they had to explain why. The latest correct ruling was announced by cold-blooded Romanian President Nicolae Ceausescu, who wants women to have more babies so the country will get richer. Here's another piece. Conservatives are out to get women's movement. They wish to attack birth control and voluntary sterilization. The eventual target is to wipe out the women's movement. And this is a good headline that highlights religious tensions. Catholics say cults taking over. End quote. So here there are real photos of from Atwood's archive. Atwood aims to prove that she did not invent the story. but and that the events described in her novel were reality somewhere, at least in potentiality. When my objects, the historical circumstances and contextual information are external and therefore not part of the analysis of Lindman's tale. In my opinion, however, this structure does not sound for two reasons. At first, my thesis is to describe the relationship of art forms to reality, and therefore the historical context has to be taken into account. Second, Dante was not formalist, and he himself emphasized the necessity to consider historical and social context. Dante's leaning towards contextualism will become more apparent concerning his adaptation of Ludwig Wittgenstein's notion forms of life. Forms of life might shed light on the problem of why we are locked in our present, even if we imagine the future. Dante has in mind the following passage from the Philosophical Investigations. Quote, "And imagine a language means to imagine form of life." End quote. Dante removes this formulation from its original context and claims that the same is true for art. For him, quote, "To imagine a work of art is to imagine a form of life in which it plays its role." End quote. One cannot interpret artworks in isolation from its social and historical context, since that context provide art with its meaning. Consequently, our artwork representing the future cannot reveal it because we have no access to the future forms of life. And from the opposite direction, our present forms or conditions of life determine our understanding and emotional reaction towards a particular work of art, even for those made in the past. If I return to Dante, he summarizes the problem of the representation of the future as follows. Quote, "The future is a kind of a mirror in which we can show only ourselves, though it seems to us a window through which we may see things to come." End quote. Or, "Nothing so much belongs to its own time as an age glimpses into the future." End quote. I think it interesting to look at the Handmaid's Tale Hulu series from the perspective of these quotations. I have already noted that the series has been filmed since 2017. Consequently, what was the future in the novel is the present and past in the series. However, the series itself mirrors our age at the same time as the before-mentioned Dickens portrait reflects the Victoria era. If I follow Dante's analysis of Robidas Levantine siècle, the Handmaid's Tale visual aspects are very contemporary, especially the fashion, hairstyle, or even car design. Supermarkets look like a new version of the supermarket of 1970s. For example, Commander Waterford uses a laptop in the episode 5 of the first series, which was not possible nor predictable in 1985 when Atwood wrote her novel. But of course, there are more important aspects than visual ones. Dante's argument has more general validity and applies to the social problems and historical events as well. The Hulu series strongly emphasizes the climate crisis and the situation of the LGBT+ community. It would imply both of these questions in her novel, but they were not that prominent, so they were more in the background. I believe that the shift of the perspective will result from our society's development and the evolution of our approach to this topic. On the one hand, one can claim that the Western society seems to be more open to them. However, on the other hand, we can observe the increase of conservative tendencies and the emphasis on the traditional family and the denial of rights of certain groups of people. In the series, there is a brief mention of the opioid epidemic in the United States. The new Glenn, a woman who replaced Emily as Offred's shopping partner, warns Offred not to ruin her current life as a handmaid, because her former life as an oxide addict was much worse. So this is a small detail, but it can illustrate how the present enters into work of art. Concerning the way Atwood addresses fertility and the fact that women are deprived of control over their reproduction in Gilead, It reminds me of the contemporary situation in Poland. So the Polish government issued new laws that ban performance of abortion even for medical reasons when the health of the mother is endangered or when the fetus shows evidence of serious genetic defect. Of the reproduction. However, reproduction decided to adapt the Handmaid's Tale because of the situation in the United States, accelerated by Donald Trump's election and the increase of conservative tendency worldwide. Although women are not deprived of their legal rights, rhetorics towards their status and situation have changed. Instead of reducing inequality between women and men in terms of children, of care of children, household differences between salaries, more voices call for the return of the traditional family, play down sexual harassment or even sexual assault, etc. In contemporary context, the idea to adapt Atwood's novel has good timing, and in consequence, handmaids have become symbols of oppression of women. So, contemporary women demonstrate dress as handmaids, and their costume speaks for themselves. So this is a photography from the demonstration against the new law in Poland. So if I return to Dante, I believe that Handmaid's Tale perfectly fits into our form of life, helping explain the series' positive reception and the reception of the book, and even the increase of the interest of this book. Our form of life enables us to understand the story and feel it. We can feel the same fears. What is dystopian in Atwood's novel is a position in a political discussion. So this is just a list of pictures I used, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, so then if anyone has any questions, just write your name in the chat box and I will call on you. I guess I could start the discussion with just a kind of quick question. You mentioned Dante having the quote that art is the representation of the future, and that the way the future is kind of represented through art as a mirror or like a reflection of the past. This might seem a little off topic, but I think you could actually contribute a lot to this question. So I research AI and how AI is trying to be creative, or at least people are trying to program AIs to be creative. And one particular algorithm, one particular group is Rutgers AI and Art Lab out of the northeastern US. And they have a creative program that produces these artworks. And one of their aims is to predict future art trends so that they can essentially monopolize or the market for art. And it seems so bizarre of a thing to be aiming for anyway. And it seems really, really dystopian. So I just wonder, I think you could probably say a lot about this. I don't know how I feel about it, but it seems like a really strange thing to try to do, to try to predict future art so you can capitalize on it. And of course, there's so many like dangers inherent in that idea to begin with, but I'm just curious kind of your thoughts on that.
Wow, it's very interesting. Well, I didn't know how exactly the computer or the AI works with this context, but I read a lot recently about the first theater play written by AI, which was I don't know, months ago or 2 months ago in Prague, and I believe that the AI works on the past artworks, isn't it, or what is now at the disposal, and the prediction is made is based on what was done in the past. So I think there will be still the closeness or the I think we cannot cut the bond to the past happening even in an AI. they might be a prediction, but let's say that the AI can predict some works on some linear development or some idea of the progress. But I still believe that there will be the connection with the past or with what is already known. So if I want to consider this, let's say the ethical dimension or the danger of AI, etc.
Thank you very much. Okay, next up is Aneta.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Šárka, for your presentation. My question is related to the Margaret Atwood itself or herself, because I know that she was awarded for Handmaid's Tale with the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Best Science Fiction Poetry, but actually her comment for Guardian was that he doesn't feel, or he doesn't feel, oh, sorry, she doesn't feel that Handmaid's Tale, it's science fiction. It's more like a speculative balladry for her, because it stems from the narrative which already happened in the past. So my question is, if you distinguish between this like a speculative literature and the dystopian novel, and how do you see those two genres, and if it's somehow like a, if you work with it, or if it fits to your research somehow?
Thank you very much for your question. So my research is more stressed on Dante. So I work with his philosophy. So I'm not a specialist on Atwood at all. It was just a coincidence that when I was reading that book, her book, I realized how it might work with Dante's position. But according his argument, there is no difference between genres. So for his thesis about how the past is, or the present, let's say, enters into an artwork, has a general validity. So it doesn't matter whether it's science fiction or dystopian novel or just like a standard novel which has with no ambition to predict or to imagine the future. But with respect to science fiction and even dystopias, this is even more apparent, or at least according to Dante.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if it could play any role if the artwork stems from the real, like from the past, or if it's totally like a new vision of the world or new system. So it doesn't play any role.
Dante would claim that a new vision is not possible. That the vision will be always burdened with the past. So it would be his position.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Up next, we have Vladimir.
Yeah, so this was a really interesting presentation, pardon. And I feel like I'm projecting my thoughts into your presentation, but I don't know how you would feel about the specific argument that I have kind of projected a lot, which goes from, you have mentioned one word, which is context, numerous times, and you have also mentioned art, which is bound to that concept, which is context. And somehow I kind of felt like one of the follow-up conclusions from that would be that art is context specific, and that every context specific art or context in general, social context, determines one specific type of utopia, which follows from that. So wouldn't you agree, or wouldn't you say that if art comes from a contextual context, it's not a flattering construction, but one contextual state of things, so to speak, wouldn't you say that every art is, and following or maybe linking up to Patrick's question, wouldn't you agree that it follows from that every utopia can be determined from the art status in one given context. Again, a lot of projection, but that's something I have followed from your presentation.
So I'm not sure whether I really got it, because there was really a lot of mention of context in different meanings actually, but for Dante, the context is very crucial, and he for all of his analysis, he emphasizes the meaning, and that the meaning is based on particular context. But it does not mean that we have no access to the past artworks, but we can feel them differently, because we can learn how it was with the work in the past, let's say the historical circumstances, why the work was done, but we feel it differently because we live in different contexts. So, and this is something which I personally think is very interesting, and it can help us understand as a tool how to get closer to something in the past. But at the same time, I don't think there's a problem that we cannot feel something, that we cannot feel the same about something as the people in the past. But I think it's a huge topic, and we can really discuss it a lot, even in more details.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. It is indeed, I would agree, an interesting topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir. And up next, we have one last question from Erik.
Thank you for the presentation, Šárka. I just wonder if there's any distinction made between future and utopian literature in Dante. Does he talk about them in different ways? Because it seems like, for example, what I mentioned in my talk, Jameson, he emphasizes the question of the utopian literature, or the impossibility of utopian literature, but that's somewhat different than just future literature. He sort of makes a sketch of non-individualist literature in a utopia or something like this, but he says it's hard to imagine because utopia is hard to imagine in itself. But does Dante make a difference between just what happens down the road and what happens in another state?
No, not at all. He is very careful about the distinctions, because he is considered himself as a pluralist. So for him, anything can be work of art, and that it doesn't. So he doesn't like everything, but he is absolutely open for everyone to take any art form and work with, to choose the genre, media, etc., or to combine everything. So for him, the idea of making series working only for some special genre or genre or style or everything, it is against his theory. So for everything he says has to have a general validity. So therefore, these small distinctions, which are very important for your position, is something not acceptable, let's say.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Šárka. Everybody give a silent applause. So I would like to welcome, up next, we have Klára Muhlová from the Institute of Musicology at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. Klára will be presenting an aesthetics of atonal music between utopia and dystopia.
So thank you for the introduction. Well, at first I have to apologize, but my camera is broken, so I will be speaking just behind the curtain. And now I will try to share my screen with the presentation. Well, do you see the presentation, please?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So, an aesthetics of atonal music between utopia and dystopia. Well, at the beginning, I prepared some information about me. I am a PhD candidate in the field of musicology at the Institute of Musicology at Faculty of Arts, Masaryk University in Brno, Czech Republic. And my basic specialization is music theory, systematic musicology. I also do music therapy, and I'm also interested in interdisciplinary research and applied research in musicology. Well, the structure of my paper is as follows. At first, I will show you some short introduction where I ask about the objectives of the research of atonal music. Then I will show some historical context and narratives about atonal music which appears through the literature. I will concentrate on a topic of totalitarian regimes and in which context they use atonal music as a model of degenerative art, or how the propaganda goes against the idea of atonal music. And then finally, I will check some topic, atonal music between utopia and dystopia. So for the introduction, I would like to say that atonal music is a phenomenon between theory and creative practice, because the theory is really interconnected with the creativity and the compositional process itself. What we can see from the research of aesthetics of atonal music is an establishment of atonality as musical language points out as to the change of musical paradigms. So it's the groundbreaking process of change, how the music is perceived and how the musical space is constructed. We have also many models which can describe and try to explain how the atonal music derives from the traditional music and how it incorporates the new meaning of music. So this is one of the examples of the models, which is, I'm sorry, it's in the Czech language. So you can see the atonal music, like written atonální in the right side. And that's a part of the evolutionary process of the whole development of the music of European tradition in general. So the objective of my paper is to study context of formation and development of atonal music and to investigate the conditions when the idea of utopia and dystopia in atonality appear. First chapter is historical context. So we are going through the history and processes. Next, some words about Second Viennese School, and then atonality and its structure, the shared vision of other composers who were close to the ideas of Second Viennese School, and then some words about atonality in Czechoslovakia and atonality about after 1945. So the situation at the beginning of the 20th century in the art, at the end of 19th century brought many high expectations to the beginning of the 20th century. The epoch called fin de siècle brought many contrasting ideas and tendencies. On one hand, the realism, decadence, or naturalism came into being. On the other hand, symbolism, art nouveau, or impressionism originated. The epoch is part of the beginning of the modernism, which is characterized by searching for new ideas, new conceptions, and new orders in art. We have, following the concept of modernism, we have also there a concept of crisis, which is the developmental crisis in art of the end of 19th century. Well, there is also a concept of crisis in music, or the classical music, as we can say. And it's a crisis of tonality. In this time, the situation in music was that composers composed very large pieces, both in the instrumentational or time perspective. And the paradigm of those large pieces started to lose its meaning. or its sense of its meaning. And Expressionism originated in fine arts. The term comes from Wilhelm Worinder, who in 1908 described Parisian artists as expressionists. In music, the term expressionism is connected with the circle of authors called as Second Viennese School, and to those authors the next part belongs to. Well, we have three authors who came together as Second Viennese School, and it was Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern, and they meet together in the aesthetics of expressionism in music. So the basic postulates of the expressionism is music is the freedom of creation and the freedom of form, and it's also followed by the beginning of atonal music. The idea of atonality became from Schoenberg, who is the visionary, and his path to atonality is started in his second string quartet, where he used groundbreaking rules of new atonal composition. Well, the composition in atonal style is based on the new order. We can define atonality as music without tonal center or tonal key, and it applies to music that doesn't conform to the system of tonal hierarchies which characterized European classical music between the 17th and 19th centuries. Atonality usually describes composition written from about 1907 to the present day, where tonality is not used as a primary foundation of work. There I have an illustrative example from Arnold Schoenberg. If it is art, it's not for all, and if it's for all, it's not art. There is an argument of elitism, which is many times said that the atonality is interconnected too. So there is a different scope of the term atonality. This is the definition from the Grove Music Online Dictionary. The term that may be used in three senses. The first, to describe all music which is not tonal. Second, to describe all music which neither tonal nor serial. And third, to describe specifically the post-tonal and pre-12th note music of Berg, Webern, or Schoenberg. So there is also a periodization of the atonal music, which is divided into several epochs or several eras, and it's very important to say that the epoch of Second Viennese School is the starting one. The next is the era after the 1945, which shows the appearance of serial music, and the third, the whole development from the 1907 to 2000 or today is the third way how to periodizate it. Well, there are 3 times or 4 times of compositional work. One is atonal or free atonal, which is just without the tonal center. There is a dodecaphony one, which is that with usage of 12-tone row. There is also a serial one, which is based on organization of 2 or more parameters of the sound, and multiserial is after the 1945. It's the technique of organizing mathematically more parameters of the sound. Well, I will skip this. And there we have a shared vision because not only the second Viennese school started to compose atonal music. Two authors who are standing in the shadow of Arnold Schoenberg are Alban Berg and Anton Webern, and they gave a really huge impact on the individuality of the composer. And Anton Webern developed a style of atonal music called punctualism. There are other musical expressionists like Ernst Krenek, Hans Eisler, Paul Dissot, René Leibowitz, or Luigi Dalla Piccola in Italy. The development of early atonality shows up outside the expressionist circles also, with the person of Joseph Matthias Hauer and Jefim Golishev. And we have also authors composing atonal music in the United States, like Dane Ruthier, Karel Ruglers, Henry Cowell, and Charles Ives. Also, we have atonal music in Czechoslovakia. There were Miroslav Pons, Alois Hába, Erwin Schulhoff, and many others who composed atonal pieces in the 1920s and 1930s. And after 1945, it's the next generation of composers concerning about atonal music. So there were serialists and multi-serialists composing the serial or multi-serial way of organizing the sound of by mathematical operations applied to parameters of sound, which are Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Pierre Boulez, or John Cage. So for the summary, we can say that music of atonality was developed by Arnold Schoenberg as a visionary, and his pupils Alban Berg and Anton Webern, and other composers followed this idea of atonal music. Well, Schoenberg himself covered the topic of atonality and dodecaphony in his collection of texts, Style and Idea. Another influential work on atonality is Theodor Wiesgund Adorno's Philosophy of New Music, especially the part Schoenberg and the Progress. Therefore, we can see that the atonality is conceptualized as the new path into the new future, and it goes in the hand with the conception of the progress. From Czech authors, we can mention Czech composer Alois Hába, who is author of the concept of liberated music. Hába tries to vindicate his complex theory of microtonality using microintervals. Those texts are the basic codification of the idea of utopia in relation to atonality as a new musical language. Few words about atonality in totalitarian regimes. Well, in 1933, there were an exhibition called Entartete Kunst in Nazi Germany, which means degenerative art, where the avant-gardist music based on atonality was shown. Authors were persecuted and Schoenberg migrated to United States. In the Soviet Union, atonality was identified with formalist tendencies, and there was a huge anti-formalist campaign. The atonality was rehabilitated by theoretist Yuri Kolopov at 1960s. And after the 1948, the atonality was in socialist Czechoslovakia also identified with formalist tendencies. The term came in 1960s it was rehabilitated by the first analytical studies on atonality of Jaroslav Volek and Stiratko Houpek. So as in general, we can say that the phenomena of appearance of music of certain type with the totalitarian regime is present in general. In Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and for example, North Korea, the rise of mass songs, marching music, and army music can be seen as a part of propaganda. And the other styles of composition, including the avant-gardist ones, are named as bad or not going with the propaganda one. And after that, I have there a part called Between Utopia and Dystopia, where I try to illustrate some more statements of the authors concerning about atonal music. So at first, Utopia, we have some cases where authors describe utopia as a way out of the crisis. Also, they see atonality as a creative truth, and atonality as a freedom, and atonality as a new future. So as the atonality as a way of crisis, it reacts on the crisis of tonality, which was in European music in the end of 19th century, where the tonality was, it was exhausted. Atonality as a truth is a compositional perspective, and the composer is honest about his ideas and about his vision, which can be free now with the atonal structure. And atonality as a new future is a way to the new horizon of musical composition, and it's manifested, those utopians perspectives are manifested in general by Schönberg and Theodor Wiesgund Adorno, who described it. And the dystopia is formulated in connection with the loss of order, also as with the atonality against nature, and it's also seen as the principle of formlessness. Some texts also point out that atonality is going against the ethics, and it's against the tradition. And some of them speak about an ugly art. So I prepared some examples of those texts. So there are some quotes to those perspectives. The trouble is that the new musical rules of Schönberg are not apparently based on innate awareness, on the intuition of tonal relationships. They are like rules of an artificial language and therefore must be learned. This would seem to lead to what used to be called form without content, or form at the expense of content, structuralism for its own sake. Well, it's necessary to say that music theorists for centuries tried to explain tonal relationships by the greater principles as the laws of universe, for example, in Johannes Kepler, Harmonices Mundi from 1690. It's the conception based on ellipses of planets, and they are in the ratio which are mirroring the tonal of the proportions of tonal system. So there was the huge argument for the music theorists to build the theories of tonality on them. Well, there's also a perspective of atonality against nature. So this is the composer Alan Hofhannes, To me, atonality is against nature. There is a center to everything that exists. The planets have to the sun, the earth, the moon. It's also the perspective which goes from this described theoretical theoretical discussions. Well, atonality, form, and the formlessness. I have there a quote by Richard Taruskin: "The lack of an underlying deep structure born out of the subconscious, as with natural languages, leads to a condition where the disconnect between the content of the utterance and the manner of its delivery becomes a constant irritant to those seeking to find meaning and pleasure in their encounter with music." So this is also one of the statements which is built on the argument that atonal music is not natural, or it's against the nature. And there is also a connection between atonality and aesthetics. Well, there are composers who flatly deny the ethics power of music, nor do they admit any moral obligation of the part of those writing. For them, music is essentially a play with tones, and although they spent a considerable amount of intelligence and craftsmanship to make it look important, the composition can be no greater value as a sociological factor than bowing or skating. The connection between atonality and the tradition, there in quote by Béla Bartók, who stated that our piece in music naturally is invariably tonal, if not always, in the sense that the inflexible major and minor system is tonal. And atonal folk music, in my opinion, is unthinkable. And he also said that there was a time when he thought he was approaching a species of 12-tone music, but even in the works of that period, he finds some tonal principles, so he tries to correct himself. And finally, atonality as an ugly art. I believe that my newly completed symphony in F sharp will show the world that atonality and ugly dissonance at the price of giving up inspiration, form, expression, melody, and beauty will result in ultimate disaster for the art of music, which is the statement of Erik Wolfgang Korngold, the composer of Czech origin who migrates to America. So my conclusion is that we can say that both utopian and dystopian statements of atonality came into being by confronting the order belongings to the older paradigm. The utopian side sees the new paths and the hope for society. The dystopian side breaks the atonality with the statement of fear, disappointment, and loss of certainty. And for the closure, I have there a quote by Alban Berg. Antichrist himself could not have thought up a more diabolical appellation than the word atonal. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry for my English.
No, it's perfect. Thank you so much. So I think everybody knows what to do about questions, and Mira will be first.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not a musical person exactly, but I have been always confused with this notion as the ethics of art, or in your sense as the ethics of music, because my notion about art is simply that it's expression. It expresses the soul, the deepest part of us, whether it's in the individual or the society. So would you consider, for example, the use of atonal art in totalitarian regimes as an abuse of art? Is there such a thing as an abuse of art? Because my notion of art has always been, you know, probably the traditional one, that art is supposed to express, to bring us, not express, but to bring us to the sublime, to bring us to a wholeness. Even if music is something like one that expresses despair, there is a certain therapeutic element in expressing despair. So it still leads us to wholeness. So just that, is there such a thing as an ethics in art? Or is art beyond ethics?
Oh, thank you for an interesting comment. I think it depends on what kind of music you think about, because some music is just about the expression of the author. Some music is just commercial, and it has nothing to do with some deeper, I don't know how to say, it's some deeper statement or some deeper meaning. So I think it depends on what kind of music you think.
All right. Thank you for your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry. If it's merely commercialism, would you consider that as an abuse of that art? Or so is it ultimately just expression?
Well, actually, I have studied economics also, so I think that where is the demand is the supply, so it's just natural to develop a commercial music when it's there. I don't know how to say it. Market, yes, when there is a market. So I wouldn't say it would be very romantic to say that it's unfair to have commercial music between us and stuff like that. I think that the realist approach sees it as just loss of economy.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. We have Aneta up next.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Klára, for your presentation. And I feel that there are like a strong tension between two terms you brought up, and it's a freedom and the rules. So we have on the one hand, there is a atonality, some controlled, like almost scientific method with like a predetermined rules you can use to create your music. And on the other hand, there is a freedom which goes hand in hand with these rules. So I just would like to ask if you could like clarify, for example, if freedom of this atonal music is something which is hidden or covered by these strict rules for Schoenberg, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that maybe it's a kind of maybe it's a kind of rebellion against the natural laws. So I posted the picture of the planets and how they are mirrored by the tonal system, those proportions between the planets and the proportions in the tonality. So I think that the new rules of atonal music is a kind of rebellion against that. So the freedom can be seen as the new order, which is completely ruled by the man and his mind. So I feel the freedom in that way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So there is a rebellion against the natural order more than a rebellion against the regime or some kind like of political order.
Yes, I would say that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Klára, can you take one more question?
Okay.
Okay, so then Nicholas will be up for the last question of the morning session.
Okay, thank you so much, Klára. My question is actually in line with Aneta's because some of my PhD students or our PhD students have heard this before, but there's this famous anecdote about Schoenberg when he enlisted in the army. The officer who called out his name said, "You're not that horrible composer, are you?" Whereby he replied, "Yes, unfortunately, no one else wanted to be him." And I take it that what he aims to, what that anecdote says is that there is a form of responsiveness to the situation in music that he's responding to, and he feels that we're at the point in which, as it were, the musical scene has been exhausted, and in order to continue to explore music, we have to do something different. So the question is, you call this a crisis, and I'm a bit worried about how much one should put into the notion of crisis here, because responding to a situation and finding a way forward, it seems like the natural order of things. It's just heightened in the era of modernism. And the question, it also, you know, adds a dimension to in what sense Schoenberg's atonal music is visionary and as it were, freedom creating. The freedom is not just to break the rules, but the freedom to continue to explore music. So that's the issue, you know, how much of this is actually a crisis, is it, I mean, one way to think about it is to say that this, what Schoenberg does is what musicians have, or composers has always done. It's just that the situation was a bit extreme, where we felt that tonal music have, you know, we filled the chart. There's nothing else to do.
Yes, so thank you for the comment. I am not sure if I caught the question.
I'm not sure there is a question. Well, the question is, you talked about this as music being in a form of crisis, but I mean, if Schoenberg is just responding and saying that, well, look, we have done this, now someone else has to do this, is that really a crisis? That's the question, because
yes.
Various music forms have always replaced other previous music forms. So the question is how much weight we should put on the term crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So maybe it can be taken as a crisis of paradigm, and the mean of how Thomas Kuhn is seeing that, or how he conceptualized this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, one could perhaps. The word crisis, of course, signals that that something's wrong.
Yes.
I'm not sure something was wrong.
Yes, that's a question.
Yeah.
Can I have a quick follow-up to this thought? Because it just came to my mind that, as Niklas pointed out, that Schoenberg did something natural to avoid the nature, kind of like somehow. Yeah, so this was something that I would like to add to the discussion, but there is no question. It's just my comment.
Okay. I guess if there's any final words from Klára, or
maybe not. Thank you for all the comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So a round of applause to you, definitely, and a big round of applause for everybody that presented today in our AM session. We're really grateful. It was really amazing, and we're going to take a short lunch break of about 2 hours, just under 2 hours, and we'll return at 2 p.m. for the afternoon session and the keynote. And then later tonight, just an hour after the afternoon session, will be a special event where we discuss the film Ticket to the Moon with the director. So if you guys haven't had a chance to see the film, there's a link in the chat. But anyway, have a nice lunch, and thank you so much, everybody. See you in a couple hours.